Welcome to Drowseworthy, where history's most dangerous moments become your most peaceful sleep. Tonight, we're exploring the first Thanksgiving, a disaster so catastrophic that you definitely wouldn't survive it. But don't worry, the calm narration and gentle rain sounds will help you drift off while learning about what really happened when two worlds collided in 1621. If you love falling asleep to history's darkest chapters, subscribe for weekly bedtime disasters. Go ahead and turn down those lights. Maybe switch on a fan for that gentle hum. Get comfortable, because we're about to journey back for centuries to a time when everything you thought you knew about Turkey, dinners and friendly pilgrims, was carefully edited for elementary school consumption. The year is 1621, and you are not sitting down to a cozy harvest feast. You are a member of the Wampanoag Confederation, and your world is ending in slow motion. But let's start at the beginning, before the Mayflower ever arrived, when your life was complex, sophisticated, and about to be irrevocably shattered. Your name is something the English will never bother to pronounce correctly, and you live in a region the newcomers will call New England, but which you know as Dongland, the place where the day begins. You are part of the Wampanoag, the people of the first light, and your confederation stretches across what will one day be called Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Your world is not primitive. Your world is not simple. Your world is a carefully balanced network of dozens of villages, complex agricultural systems, and diplomatic relationships that have been refined over thousands of years. Let's be clear about something from the start. You are not waiting in the wilderness for Europeans to bring you civilization. You have civilization. You have agriculture that feeds thousands. You have a democratic confederation that makes decisions through consensus. You have a justice system, a trade network that stretches to the Great Lakes, and a spiritual tradition that connects you to every plant, animal, and season in this land. Your morning begins before dawn, as it always does. The longhouse where you sleep with your extended family is warm from the central fire that burns continuously. The structure itself is a marvel of engineering that the English, huddling in their poorly constructed Plymouth houses, will never appreciate. Your home is built from a framework of saplings, covered with bark and woven mats that can be adjusted for ventilation. In winter, it holds heat. In summer, it stays cool. It can house up to 60 people comfortably, with separate spaces for different families, storage areas for food, and room for community gatherings. You rise and step outside into air so clean it almost hurts to breathe. The village around you is not a random collection of shelters. It's planned. There are fields of corn, beans, and squash growing in the Three Sisters Formation, an agricultural technique so sophisticated that modern farmers still use variations of it. The corn provides a structure for beans to climb. The beans fix nitrogen in the soil. The squash spreads across the ground, retaining moisture and preventing weeds. It's permaculture, 400 years before the term exists. Beyond the fields, the forest is not wilderness. It's managed. Your people have been using controlled burns for generations to clear underbrush, promote the growth of berry bushes and nut trees, and create park-like spaces where deer can graze. When the English arrive and see these open forests, they'll write home about the natural beauty of the land, never understanding that what they're seeing is the result of centuries of careful stewardship. Your days follow the rhythm of the seasons in ways the English, with their rigid calendars and fixed schedules, will never comprehend. Spring means fishing for herring and alewives as they run up the rivers to spawn. You catch thousands of them, enough to fertilize your fields and smoke for winter. Summer means tending the crops, gathering berries, and preparing for the harvest. Fall means hunting and preserving meat, harvesting corn and squash, gathering nuts. Winter means storytelling, tool making, and living off the abundance you've stored. Your diet is better than anything the English eat. You have protein from fish, shellfish, deer, turkey, and other game. You have carbohydrates from corn, beans, and squash. You have vitamins from berries, nuts, and wild plants. You have variety, abundance, and most importantly, you have knowledge. You know which plants heal, which feed, which kill. You know when to harvest cattail roots for flour. You know how to tap birch trees for syrup. You know how to smoke fish so it lasts through winter. You know how to make pemmican that stays edible for years. The English will look at your foodways and call them primitive. They'll insist on English wheat and English livestock and English methods, even though these things are poorly suited to this environment. They'll starve while surrounded by food because they're too proud or too ignorant to learn from you. And even as they depend on your knowledge for survival, they'll write home describing you as savages who need to be civilized. Your political system is more democratic than anything in Europe. Decisions are made through consensus. Your sachems lead because the people follow them, not because of hereditary right alone. Women have voices in council. Elders are respected for their wisdom. Children are taught through patient example rather than harsh punishment. When the English see this, they'll call it chaos, disorder, a lack of proper authority. They cannot conceive of a society that functions without rigid hierarchy and punishment. But this morning, in 1621, something is wrong. Something has been wrong for 4 years now, and it's getting worse. The sickness came first in 1616. Your people have a word for it, but the English will call it the Great Dying or the Plague. Modern historians will debate whether it was smallpox, leptospirosis, or viral hepatitis. What matters is that it killed between 75 and 90% of your people, not over centuries. In 3 years. Imagine waking up one morning and by the end of the week, 3/4 of everyone you know is dead. Your mother, your children, the sachems who lead your confederacy, the healers who know which plants cure and which kill, the elders who carry the oral history of your people, the farmers who know the exact moment to plant. Gone. Villages that housed hundreds now have 20 survivors. Longhouses that echoed with conversation and laughter stand empty. Fields that fed thousands grow wild with weeds. The dead are so numerous that proper burial rites become impossible. You burn the bodies when you have strength. You leave them when you don't. The smoke of funeral pyres darkens the sky for months. And it's not just the death that destroys you. It's the knowledge loss. Your society doesn't have written language in the European sense. Your history, your medicine, your spiritual practices, your agricultural wisdom, all of it is passed down orally from generation to generation. When the elders die, entire libraries of knowledge die with them. Ceremonies that have been performed for 1,000 years are forgotten because no one is left who knows all the words, all the steps, all the meanings. The English didn't bring this plague, at least not directly, not this time. It likely came from earlier European contact, from fishermen and traders who stopped along the coast. But the English will benefit from it in ways that should make every Thanksgiving table uncomfortable. When the Mayflower passengers stumble ashore in December 1620, they are not brave pioneers taming a wilderness. They are refugees occupying a mass grave. The village they will call Plymouth is Patuxet, and it's empty because everyone who lived there is dead. The cleared fields they plant in aren't virgin soil. They're your people's farms, abandoned because there's no one left to work them. The caches of seed corn they find and take, the ones they'll later call a gift from God, those are buried stores meant to feed families that no longer exist. The English will interpret this as divine providence. God cleared the land for them. God provided empty villages and planted fields. God removed the savages so his chosen people could build a new Jerusalem. They'll write this in their journals and letters. They'll preach it from their pulpits. They'll use it to justify everything that comes after. Never mind that what they're calling divine intervention was actually a disease vector that killed thousands of real people with real lives and real families. Never mind that they're scavenging through graveyards and calling it a miracle. You watched them that first winter, these English newcomers, your Sechamel Sumakwin, who the English will call Massasoit, has forbidden any contact. Your people have experienced Europeans before, and it rarely ends well. There were the explorers who kidnapped your people to sell as slaves in Europe. There was Thomas Hunt, who in 1614 tricked 27 men onto his ship and sold them in Spain. One of those men was Tisquantum, who the English called Squanto, and his story is far darker than any elementary school lesson suggests. You watch the English die, and they die in droves. By spring, half of them are dead. They're unprepared, unskilled, and starving in a land of plenty because they don't know which plants to eat, when to fish, or how to hunt. Their houses are cold and damp. They're getting scurvy because they don't know about vitamin C. They're weak, desperate, and increasingly dangerous. Part of you thinks maybe they'll all die and this problem will solve itself. But another part of you, the part that has been shaped by your people's values of compassion and community, feels pity for them. They're incompetent, yes, but they're also dying. Their children are dying, and you've seen enough death. This is when your sachem makes a decision that will be debated by your descendants for 400 years. He decides to ally with the English. It's not a simple decision, and it's not made out of naive kindness. Your confederation has been devastated by disease. Your traditional enemies, the Narragansett to the west, were less affected by the plague and are now a serious threat. You need allies. These English have guns and metal tools. They might be useful. In March 1621, Tisquantum becomes the intermediary. His story is a horror show all its own. He was kidnapped, sold into slavery in Spain, escaped to England, made his way back across the Atlantic, only to discover that his entire village, every single person he knew, was dead from the plague. Now he's helping the people whose countrymen destroyed his life, because what else can he do? He teaches the English how to plant corn with fish, fertilizer, where to hunt, how to trap eels. He's not doing this out of altruism. He's positioning himself as indispensable, playing both sides, trying to create a power base in a world that has taken everything from him. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history's chaos, consider subscribing for more bedtime disasters. Now, let's get back to 1621. The summer of 1621 is tense. Your people are teaching the English to survive, but you're also watching them carefully. They're building fortifications. They're organizing military drills. They're calling your sachem king and treating the diplomatic relationship as if Mequin has somehow submitted to English authority. He hasn't. Your confederation doesn't work that way. But the English don't understand, or don't care to understand, the difference. They're also establishing rules that make no sense to you. They claim ownership of specific plots of land, drawing invisible lines and saying, "This is mine, that is yours." Land cannot be owned. Land is like air or water. You can use it, care for it, live on it, but own it. The concept is absurd. It's like claiming to own the wind or the rain. But the English are deadly serious about these invisible lines. They're already arguing among themselves about property boundaries. They're making marks on paper and claiming these marks have power over the earth itself. You watch this and wonder what kind of madness has brought these people to your shores. Then comes the harvest. The English have managed to bring in crops, largely because your people taught them how. Governor William Bradford decides to have a celebration. This is not unusual. Harvest festivals are common. Your people have been holding them for generations. What happens next is not a friendly, multicultural potluck. The English fire their guns in celebration. The sound echoes for miles. Your warriors hear it and think the English are under attack, or possibly attacking. Ausa Mequin and 90 of your people show up, armed and ready for conflict. But there's no conflict. There's just the English, celebrating. Now here's where the story gets complicated. You're stuck. You've shown up with 90 warriors to what turns out to be a party. Leaving immediately would be an insult, a breaking of diplomatic protocols. So you stay. For 3 days. The English will write home about this gathering, about how the Indians celebrated with them. What they won't write is that your people provided most of the food. The English had some fowl, possibly turkey, possibly duck, maybe some geese. Your people brought 5 deer and likely contributed corn, squash, and shellfish. The English were not generous hosts. They were inadequate hosts whose guests had to bring their own food so no one would starve. There's no record that anyone gave thanks. There's no record of any religious component at all. This was a secular harvest celebration, and it was awkward. The English and your people don't speak the same language beyond a few words. Tisquantum translates, but how do you translate entire worldviews? The English think they've been given this land by God. Your people know the land cannot be owned, only cared for. The English are already talking about expanding, about bringing more settlers, about permanent colonies. Your people are watching your world shrink. You eat venison and succotash. You probably don't eat turkey. That will become a tradition much later. You definitely don't eat pumpkin pie or cranberry sauce or any of the foods that will become Thanksgiving staples. You sit in the autumn sun and you make polite conversation through a traumatized translator, and you know, somewhere deep in your bones, that this alliance is temporary. Because here's what's not being said during this 3-day gathering. The English are illegal immigrants by any definition. They didn't land at Plymouth Rock because they were aiming for it. They were supposed to be in Virginia. They ended up in your territory by accident, and they never asked permission to stay. They settled on Patuxet without any acknowledgement that this land belonged to people who had just died. They're squatters on a mass grave, and they're already making plans to invite more squatters. Your sachem is trying to manage an impossible situation. He's trying to use the English as a counterweight to the Narragansett. He's trying to rebuild his confederation's power after the plague. He's trying to believe that this alliance can work. But you, sitting there eating deer meat and watching these strange people with their strange customs, you have doubts. And you should. Because what comes next is not friendship. It's not cooperation. It's a slow-motion genocide that will be dressed up as manifest destiny. Within a generation, more English will come. Thousands of them. They will want more land. They will bring more diseases. They will sign treaties and break them. They will start wars and blame your people for them. In 1637, just 16 years after this awkward feast, English colonists will surround a Pequot village and set it on fire, killing between 400 and 700 people, mostly women and children. In 1675, your Sachem's son, Metacom, who the English call King Philip, will lead a desperate war to push back the English expansion. He will lose. His head will be displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 25 years. His wife and 9-year-old son will be sold into slavery in the Caribbean. But that's all in the future. Right now, it's 1621, and you're sitting at what history will call the first Thanksgiving. You're eating food your people provided. You're watching the English celebrate a harvest they barely understand how to produce. You're listening to Tisquantum translate between two worlds that will never really understand each other. And you're wondering how this ends. Spoiler alert, it doesn't end well for your people. The Thanksgiving story, as taught in American schools, is a lie. Not a small lie. Not an exaggeration. A fundamental rewriting of history designed to make colonization seem friendly, to make genocide seem inevitable and perhaps even necessary, to turn a complicated, tragic, violent history into a simple story about sharing and gratitude. The real story is this. Your people tried to help starving refugees. Those refugees became invaders. The friendship celebrated at Thanksgiving lasted approximately 5 minutes in historical terms. The harvest feast of 1621 was not the beginning of a beautiful relationship. It was the last moment before everything fell apart. And every year, when Americans sit down to eat turkey and stuffing, they're celebrating a myth. They're not honoring your people. They're erasing you. They're replacing your sophisticated civilization with a stereotype of primitive Indians waiting to be saved by European culture. They're turning a story of plague, land theft, broken treaties, and genocide into a heartwarming tale about pilgrims and Indians becoming friends. You deserve better than that. Your people, who managed these lands for thousands of years, who built complex societies, who tried to help newcomers, who fought desperately to save their world. They deserve better than being reduced to a side character in someone else's origin story. So this Thanksgiving, when you sit down to feast, remember the Wampanoag, not as helpers or sidekicks, but as real people with real civilizations who watched their world die. Remember that the land the pilgrims settled was not empty wilderness, but a cultivated homeland. Remember that the first Thanksgiving was not a meeting of equals, but an awkward diplomatic encounter between a devastated people and the beginning of an invasion. Remember and be grateful that you're not living through the end of your world, which is exactly what every Wampanoag person was experiencing in 1621. Your 3 days at this feast are almost over. Soon you'll return to your village, to the reduced numbers of your people, to the growing presence of these English settlers. You'll try to maintain the alliance. You'll try to protect what's left of your world. And you'll fail, not because you weren't strong or smart or brave, but because you're facing an invasion that brings diseases you can't fight and a mindset that refuses to see you as fully human. The first Thanksgiving is not a beginning. It's an ending, dressed up in feast clothes. And now you know why it sucked to be a Wampanoag in 1621. The tragic life of Tisquantum Squanto, the man who survived the impossible. The name Squanto appears in every elementary school Thanksgiving pageant. He's the friendly Indian who helped the pilgrims plant corn and catch fish. He's a supporting character in someone else's story, a helpful native who conveniently spoke English and showed up at just the right moment. He's been reduced to a plot device, a narrative convenience that makes the Thanksgiving story work. But Tisquantum, his real name, was a real person, and his story is so horrific, so unbelievably tragic, that if you wrote it as fiction, people would say it was too far-fetched to be believable. This is the story of a man who survived the impossible multiple times, only to return home and find that everything he loved was gone. This is the story of a man who helped his enemies because he had no other choice. This is the story that should be told every Thanksgiving, and almost never is. Let's start in 1605, or maybe it's 1614. The historical records are unclear, and that's fitting because almost everything about Tisquantum's life exists in the gaps between what Europeans bothered to write down. What we know is this: Tisquantum is born in Patuxet, a thriving Wampanoag village on the coast of what will become Massachusetts. He grows up in a world that is complex, sophisticated, and stable. He learns to fish, to hunt, to plant. He learns the stories of his people, the diplomatic protocols, the spiritual practices. He has a family, though we don't know their names. He has friends, though history never records them. He has a life, though that life is about to be violently interrupted. In 1605, or possibly earlier, English explorer George Weymouth arrives on the coast. He's mapping, trading, and kidnapping. Weymouth takes 5 Wampanoag men back to England. Some accounts say Tisquantum is one of them. Others say this is a different incident. What matters is that by 1614, Tisquantum has somehow ended up as a guide and translator for English explorers. He's been to England. He's learned English. He's working with Captain John Smith. Yes, that John Smith, the Pocahontas John Smith, who is exploring and mapping the New England coast. Tisquantum thinks he's finally going home. He's helping Smith map the coastline. He's translating between the English and various native groups. He thinks that after years in England, after learning this strange language and these strange customs, he's finally going to return to Patuxet, to his family, to his life. And then Thomas Hunt betrays him. Hunt is captain of one of Smith's ships. Smith leaves to return to England. Hunt stays behind, supposedly to finish trading for furs. But Hunt has other plans. He invites 27 Wampanoag men, including Tisquantum, onto his ship. He's friendly. He's offering trade goods. "Come aboard," he says. "Let's do business." And then Hunt locks them in the hold and sets sail for Spain. Think about that moment. You're Tisquantum. You've survived being taken to England years ago. You've learned English. You've made yourself useful to these explorers. You've been working to get home. You're so close you can see the smoke from your village's fires. And then you're betrayed, locked in darkness, and sailed across the ocean again. But this time it's not to England. This time it's to Spain, to the slave markets of Malaga. The journey across the Atlantic in the hold of a ship is its own kind of hell. You're packed in with 26 other men in a space not designed for human habitation. It's dark most of the time. The air is thick with the smell of bodies, vomit, and human waste. The ship pitches and rolls in the waves. You're sick constantly. You can't stand up straight. You can barely move. Some men go mad. Some men give up and stop eating. Some men pray to spirits that seem to have abandoned them entirely. And Tisquantum has been through this before. He knows what's coming. He knows that at the end of this nightmare voyage, he'll be sold. He knows that his life, his humanity, his very personhood will be reduced to a price. He's already lived through this once, and here it is again, except this time it's worse because he was so close to home. He could see Patuxet. He could practically smell the cooking fires and hear the familiar sounds of his language, and then it was ripped away. Hunt sells the 27 men as slaves. He gets £20 per man. That's about £540 total, a fortune in 1614. £20 per human life. That's what Tisquantum is worth. to Thomas Hunt. But somehow, and we don't know exactly how, Tisquantum escapes. Local Spanish friars, horrified by Hunt's actions, intervene. They buy several of the men from the slave markets, including Tisquantum. They're trying to save souls, to convert these heathens to Christianity, but they're also saving lives. Tisquantum lives with the friars for an unknown amount of time. He learns Spanish. He's already been forced to learn English. Now he's learning a third language, picking up pieces of a third culture, surviving in a third foreign land. The friars are kind, relatively speaking. They feed him. They clothe him. They teach him about Jesus and sin and salvation. They mean well, probably, but they're also completely dismantling his worldview. Everything he learned about the spirits in the land, the connections between all living things, the cycles of nature and reciprocity, all of it is being labeled as savage superstition. He's being told that his people's wisdom, accumulated over thousands of years, is worthless. He's being told that he needs to abandon his identity to save his soul. And what choice does he have? He's alone in Spain. He doesn't know the language yet. He doesn't know the customs. He has no money, no family, no friends, no way to survive except through the charity of these friars. So he learns Spanish. He learns about Christianity. He becomes whatever he needs to become to survive. It's what he's good at now. Adaptation, survival, becoming what others need him to be so they don't discard him. And he starts trying to get home. Somehow, Tisquantum makes his way from Spain to England. The details are lost to history. Does he work his way aboard a ship? Does someone pay his passage? We don't know. What we do know is that by 1617, he's in London, living with a merchant named John Slaney who has interests in the Newfoundland Company. Tisquantum is working, surviving, and constantly trying to find a way back across the Atlantic. London in 1617 is overwhelming. It's massive compared to anything in the Wampanoag world. It's dirty, crowded, and loud. The Thames River is an open sewer. The streets are narrow and filthy. Disease is everywhere. The social hierarchy is rigid and brutal. And Tisquantum is navigating all of this while planning his return home, while holding on to the memory of Patuxet, while trying not to forget his language or his identity or who he was before all of this happened. In 1619, he finally gets his chance. Captain Thomas Dermer is planning a voyage to New England. Dermer needs a guide and translator. Tisquantum, who by now has spent approximately 5 years in captivity and exile, sees his opportunity. He signs on with Dermer. He's going home. Finally, after kidnapping, slavery, living with Spanish friars, making his way to London, and years of exile, he's going home to Patuxet. They arrive in 1619. Tisquantum guides Dermer along the coast. He's recognizing landmarks. He's getting closer to Patuxet. He's thinking about his family, his friends, his village. He's thinking about sleeping in his own home, eating food prepared by his mother or his wife, speaking his own language with people who have known him since birth. He's been dreaming of this moment for 5 years, and then he arrives at Patuxet and discovers that everyone is dead. The plague that swept through in 1616-1617 killed everyone in his village. His family, gone. His friends, gone. The children he played with, the elders who taught him, the hunters he worked with, the women who made his clothes, everyone he ever knew in his entire life before his kidnapping, all of them are dead. The village is empty. The longhouses are collapsing. The fields are overgrown. There are bones, probably. There are ghosts, definitely. Tisquantum has survived kidnapping, slavery, exile, and an ocean voyage home, only to discover that there's nothing left to come home to. The plague didn't just kill his people, it killed his entire world. His language is now spoken by a few scattered survivors. His village is a graveyard. His life, the one he had before Thomas Hunt locked him in a ship's hold, that life is completely, utterly, irretrievably gone. Take a moment and really sit with that. Imagine being ripped from your home, sold as a slave, spending years trying to get back, and finally returning to discover that everyone you ever loved is dead. Not some of them, all of them. Your entire community erased, and you weren't there when it happened. You couldn't help them. You couldn't say goodbye. You couldn't bury them properly. You were in Spain, in England, learning foreign languages and surviving in foreign lands while your people died en masse. What do you do with that grief? Where do you even put it? Tisquantum goes to Nemascot, a nearby village, and stays with the Wampanoag there. He's with his people, but he's not home. He can never be home again because home no longer exists. He's a man without a village, without a family, without a place. In a culture where identity is tied to community and kinship, he's been cut loose. He's floating. He's broken. And then, in March 1620, he hears that English settlers have moved into Patuxent. They're calling it Plymouth now. They're building houses on the ashes of his village. They're planting crops in his people's fields. They're living on his literal doorstep, on top of his dead. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history's chaos, consider subscribing for more bedtime disasters. Now, let's get back to Tisquantum's impossible choices. The Sachemassamaquin, known to the English as Massasoit, decides to make contact with these new settlers, and he needs a translator. There's only one person available who speaks both Wampanoag and English, Tisquantum. So, Tisquantum walks into Plymouth in March 1621, and he says, in English, "Welcome, Englishmen." The pilgrims are astonished. It's a miracle. God has sent them a native who speaks English. How convenient. How providential. They never ask him how he learned English. They never ask him where he's from. They never ask him what happened to his people. They just accept this gift from God and put him to work. And Tisquantum, what choice does he have? He's alone in the world. His entire village is dead. The English are living where his home used to be. He can help them, or he can walk away. And if he walks away, then what? He has no community of his own anymore. He's already lost everything. At least by helping the English, he has purpose. At least he's useful. At least he's not completely alone. So he teaches them. He shows them how to plant corn with fish fertilizer, placing the fish in the ground with the corn seed to provide nutrients as it decomposes. He shows them the best fishing spots. He teaches them how to build weirs to trap fish. He tells them which plants are edible, which are medicinal, which will kill them. He's saving their lives, these people who are living on the grave of his civilization. The irony is suffocating. The English write in their journals about God's providence, about how the land was cleared for them, about how the savages died so they could live, about how God sent them a translator at exactly the right moment. They're interpreting Tisquantum's trauma as divine intervention. They're treating the death of his entire world as a gift to them. And Tisquantum is stuck. He's living in Plymouth, sleeping near the people who occupy his home village, speaking English more than he speaks Wampanoag, helping his people's future enemies establish themselves. He's in an impossible position, and he starts playing both sides. He tells the English that other tribes are planning to attack. He tells other tribes that the English are plague buried under their storehouse, that they can release at will. He's manipulating, positioning himself as indispensable to both sides, trying to create some kind of power base for himself in a world that has taken everything from him. Can you blame him? He has no village, no family, no community in the traditional sense. He's trying to make himself matter, to give himself value, to prevent himself from being discarded. The English grow suspicious of him. Other Wampanoag leaders, including Mequin, grow tired of his manipulations. Tisquantum is caught between two worlds and trusted by neither. He's too English for the Wampanoag and too native for the English. He exists in the gap between cultures, and that gap is crushing him. In November 1622, just over a year after the first Thanksgiving, Tisquantum becomes ill while guiding an English expedition around Cape Cod. He's bleeding from the nose. It might be a disease, it might be poison, we don't know. What we do know is that as he's dying, he asks the English governor, William Bradford, to pray for him, to ask the Christian God to take him to heaven so he can be with the English colonists after death. Think about that deathbed request. He's not asking to join his ancestors. He's not calling on the spirits of his people. He's asking to go to the English heaven. He's so alienated from his own culture, so broken by his experiences, that even in death he's looking toward the world of his captors rather than the world of his birth. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe he just wants to go somewhere, anywhere, where someone will remember him. His people are dead. His village is gone. The Wampanoag who survive see him as a manipulator and a traitor. The only people who will remember Tisquantum are the English, and even they'll get his story wrong. They'll turn him into Squanto, the helpful Indian, erasing everything that made him human, all his pain and complexity and impossible choices. Bradford writes that Tisquantum's death was a great loss, not because he cared about Tisquantum as a person, but because he was useful. Tisquantum was a tool to Bradford, a gift from God, a convenient translator who showed up at just the right moment. When he died, he became another footnote in the Pilgrim story, a supporting character who exits the narrative when his usefulness ends. But Tisquantum was a real person. He survived horrors that most people couldn't imagine. He was kidnapped, at least twice. He was sold as a slave. He learned 3 foreign languages. He navigated multiple cultures. He crossed the Atlantic Ocean at least 4 times, in an era when that voyage killed a significant percentage of passengers. He survived when almost everyone he knew died. He made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. He tried to create power for himself in a world that had stripped him of everything. And then he died, alone, far from what used to be his home, probably not much older than 30, asking to go to an English heaven because his own heaven was too painful to imagine, because his own afterlife would be full of the ghosts of everyone he failed to save, everyone he wasn't there to help, everyone who died while he was in Spain or England or trying to get home. The story of Tisquantum is not a story of a helpful native. It's a story of trauma, survival, manipulation, and unimaginable loss. It's a story about what happens when your entire world is destroyed and you're left picking through the rubble, trying to find some way to matter, some way to be valuable, some way to survive. It's a story about the impossible choices people make when all their options are terrible. Every year, school children dress up as pilgrims and Indians and act out the first Thanksgiving. Some kid plays Squanto, the helpful Indian who taught the pilgrims to fish and plant corn. That kid has no idea that the real Tisquantum watched his entire civilization die. That kid has no idea about the kidnapping, the slavery, the exile, the homecoming to an empty village. That kid has no idea about the manipulation, the desperation, the impossible position of being caught between worlds. The real story is too dark for elementary school. The real story doesn't fit into the neat narrative of pilgrims and Indians becoming friends. The real story reveals that the Thanksgiving myth is built on tragedy, that the helpful Indian who made the feast possible was a broken man living in the ruins of his world, helping his people's future destroyers because he had nowhere else to go and nothing else to be. Drop a comment below and let us know what topic you'd like us to explore next, or just check in and tell us how you're doing. You're an important part of our little corner of the internet, and we love hearing from you. Tisquantum deserves to be remembered as more than a plot device. He deserves to be remembered as a survivor, a victim, a manipulator, a tragic figure, a complex human being who did his best in circumstances that would have destroyed most people. He deserves to be remembered for what he actually was, not what the Thanksgiving story needs him to be. So the next time someone mentions Squanto and the helpful Indians at the first Thanksgiving, remember Tisquantum. Remember the kidnapping and the slavery and the exile. Remember the empty village and the impossible choices. Remember that the man who taught the pilgrims to survive was himself barely surviving, adrift in a world that had taken everything from him and given him nothing but pain in return. And remember that his story, his real story, is the one we should be telling. The mystery of the vanished Roanoke colony and the native peoples who knew what happened. In 1587, 115 English colonists disappeared from Roanoke, island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. They vanished so completely that the only clue left behind was a single word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. This mystery has captivated historians, archaeologists, and conspiracy theorists for over 400 years. Where did the colonists go? What happened to them? Why did they leave no other trace? But here's the thing about the Lost Colony of Roanoke. It's only lost to the English, the native peoples of the region, the Croatoan, the Squanto, the Wampanoag. They probably knew exactly what happened. They just weren't asked, or when they were asked, their answers weren't believed or recorded properly. The mystery of Roanoke is less about vanished colonists and more about how history gets written, who gets to tell it, and whose voices are ignored. Let's start at the beginning, because the Roanoke story doesn't begin in 1587. It begins in 1584 when English explorers first arrive on the Outer Banks. They're scouting for locations to establish a colony, and they meet the local Algonquian peoples. The natives are cautious but curious. These Europeans have goods to trade, metal tools, weapons. There's potential for an alliance here, or at least a trading relationship. The English return in 1585 with a larger expedition. This time, they're not just exploring, they're colonizing. They establish a fort on Roanoke Island, and almost immediately, things go wrong. The colonists are unprepared for life in this environment. They don't know how to fish effectively in these waters. They don't know which plants are edible. They don't know how to plant crops in this climate. Sound familiar? This is the Plymouth story, except it's happening 35 years earlier. The local Squanto people try to help at first. They provide food. They teach the English about the land. But the English are demanding, arrogant, and increasingly violent. When a silver cup goes missing, the English decide the Squanto stole it. In retaliation, they burn an entire village to the ground. An entire village destroyed over a cup that may not have even been stolen. The violence doesn't stop there. Ralph Lane, the military leader of the 1585 colony, becomes increasingly paranoid. He believes the Squanto chief Winjuna is plotting against the English. His evidence is thin, based mostly on rumors and his own suspicions. But Lane decides to act first. He invites Winjina to a meeting under the pretense of peace talks. When Winjina arrives with a small group of advisors, the English attack. They shoot several men and attempt to behead Winjina. The chief escapes initially, wounded, but is hunted down and killed. His head is brought back to the fort as a trophy. This is the context that matters. This is the history that shapes everything that follows. The 1587 colonists are not arriving in a pristine wilderness where natives are eagerly waiting to help. They're arriving in a region where the English have already proven themselves to be treacherous, violent, and willing to commit murder over perceived slights. Every native person in the region knows what happened to Winjina. Every tribe has heard about the village burned over a silver cup. The English have already established their reputation, and it's not good. The Squanto, understandably, stop helping. The colonists start starving. Relations deteriorate further. When Sir Francis Drake stops by in 1586, the surviving colonists beg him to take them back to England. He does. The first Roanoke colony is a complete failure, and it's a failure caused largely by English incompetence and violence. But England is not done with Roanoke. In 1587, a new group of colonists arrives. This time, it's not just soldiers and adventurers. It's families. There are women and children. They're planning to establish a permanent settlement, to build homes and farms, to create a New England in the Americas. Their leader is John White, an artist and mapmaker who was part of the 1585 expedition. White saw the violence. He documented it in his drawings and journals. He knows how badly the previous expedition handled relations with the natives. He's hoping to do better. The colonists arrive to find the fort from the previous expedition abandoned and overgrown. The local natives are understandably hostile. The English burned their village 2 years ago. They murdered their chief. Why would they help now? But the colonists need assistance. They need food. They need guidance. They're struggling. White tries to rebuild relationships. He reaches out to the Croatoan, who had maintained relatively good relations with the English. A Croatoan man named Manteo, who had traveled to England and back with White, serves as an intermediary. The Croatoan are willing to trade, willing to communicate, but cautious. Trust has to be rebuilt, and that takes time the colonists may not have. John White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, gives birth to a daughter on August 18th, 1587. The baby is named Virginia Dare, and she becomes the first English child born in the Americas. She's 9 days old when John White makes a decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. The colony needs supplies. They need more colonists. They need support from England. White sails back to England, leaving his daughter, his granddaughter, and the other 114 colonists on Roanoke Island. He promises to return quickly, within a few months. He doesn't return for 3 years. It's not entirely his fault. England is at war with Spain. All ships are pressed into military service. The Spanish Armada is threatening invasion. No one cares about a struggling colony on the other side of the Atlantic when the homeland is under threat. White tries multiple times to get back to Roanoke. He's blocked, delayed, redirected. His personal anguish is recorded in his journals. He's desperate to get back to his family. But the machinery of empire doesn't care about one man's family. Imagine being one of the colonists left on Roanoke. Your leader, the governor, sailed away promising to return in a few months. Months pass, a year passes, 2 years pass. You're running low on supplies. Your relations with most local tribes are strained at best, hostile at worst. You have children to feed, including babies born on the island who have never known any other home. What do? You have several options, none of them good. You can stay on Roanoke and hope White returns, but your supplies are dwindling and you're vulnerable to attack. You can try to sail to England yourselves, but you have limited boats and crossing the Atlantic is incredibly dangerous, especially without experienced sailors. You can try to march north toward the Chesapeake Bay, where the colony was originally supposed to be established, but that's a long journey through potentially hostile territory. Or you can accept the help that's being offered by the one group of natives who haven't completely written you off, the Croatoan. The Croatoan have food, they have shelter, they have knowledge of how to survive in this environment. And through Manteo, they have a connection to the English, someone who understands both cultures and can serve as a bridge. If the Croatoan are offering to take you in to help you survive until White returns, why wouldn't you accept? Your children are hungry, your supplies are exhausted, you're isolated and vulnerable. Going to Croatoan isn't giving up, it's surviving. Finally, in 1590, White gets passage on a privateering expedition that agrees to stop at Roanoke. He arrives on his granddaughter's 3rd birthday, and he finds nothing. The settlement is abandoned. The houses have been taken apart in an orderly fashion, suggesting the colonists left deliberately, not in a panic. The defensive palisade they built has been partially dismantled, and carved into one of the palisade posts is the word Croatoan. Carved into a tree nearby are the letters Crow. White had told the colonists before he left that if they had to move, they should carve their destination into a tree. If they were in distress, they should carve a Maltese cross above the message. There's no cross, just the word Croatoan. Croatoan is not a mystery, it's a place. It's an island about 50 miles south of Roanoke, known today as Hatteras Island. It's also the name of the native people who live there, the Croatoan, who had been friendly to the English. One of them, Manteo, had travelled to England with earlier expeditions and maintained good relations with the colonists. If the colonists left a message saying they went to Croatoan, they probably went to Croatoan. But White never gets to check. A storm is coming. The ship's captain refuses to make the journey south to Croatoan. They need to leave now or risk being caught in a hurricane. White begs, pleads, argues. He's so close. His family is probably just 50 miles away, but the captain is firm. They're leaving. White is forced back onto the ship, and he never returns to the Americas. He spends the rest of his life not knowing what happened to his daughter and granddaughter. The tragedy of John White is that he was probably right. His family was likely on Croatoan Island, living with Manteo's people, waiting for him to return. They carved the message exactly as he'd instructed. They left no cross because they weren't in distress, at least not at the moment of departure. They'd made an orderly decision to relocate to a place where they could get help, and White got within 50 miles of them before being forced to turn back. He died never knowing that the mystery he left behind wasn't a mystery at all, just a message that was never followed up on. So what did happen to the lost colony? The most likely answer, the one supported by archaeological evidence and native oral traditions, is that they integrated with local tribes. Some probably went to Croatoan Island, as the carving suggested. Others may have traveled inland and joined other Algonquian communities. They didn't vanish. They were absorbed. And this makes perfect sense. The colonists were struggling. They had no supply line. They had hostile neighbors. They had limited resources. but they had skills that might be valuable to native communities. They had metal tools. They had weapons. Some of them had useful knowledge. And, crucially, they had children who needed protecting. Virginia Dare was 3 years old. There were other children born on Roanoke. Their parents would have done anything to keep them safe. The native peoples of the region, particularly the Croatoan, were pragmatic. They'd dealt with Europeans before. Some relationships were good, some were bad. If a group of English colonists wanted to integrate, to live according to native customs, to intermarry and become part of the community, why not? It increased the community's numbers. It brought new skills and tools. It was a practical solution to the colonists' crisis and potentially beneficial to the tribes. Integration didn't mean the English would maintain their separate identity. It meant learning the Croatoan language. It meant adopting Croatoan clothing, foodways, spiritual practices. It meant English women marrying Croatoan men and English men marrying Croatoan women. It meant children growing up as Croatoan, speaking Croatoan as their first language, identifying as Croatoan. Within a generation, the distinction between colonist and native would blur. Within 2 generations, it would disappear entirely. There's evidence for this integration scattered through the historical record, if you know where to look. In the early 1600s, when English colonists established Jamestown and started exploring the region, they hear stories from native peoples about white people living among various tribes. In 1607, Chief Powhatan tells the Jamestown colonists that he destroyed a group of white people living with the Chesapeake tribe. He says they had houses like the English and wore English clothes. Were these Roanoke survivors? It's possible. Force at Jamestown. Powhatan has seen what English colonies become. He's seen the demands for land, the violence, the diseases. In 1608, colonists report meeting natives with grey eyes and beards, features uncommon among Algonquian peoples. In 1612, William Strachey records native stories about people who lived in houses with 2 stories, who used metal tools, who spoke a foreign language. In 1650, English explorer John Lawson reports meeting Hatteras natives, the descendants of the Croatoan, who claimed their ancestors could talk in a book, meaning they could read and write, and that several of their ancestors were white. These aren't vague legends. These are specific, detailed accounts of cultural markers that suggest English presence among native populations. The ability to read and write was not common among Algonquian peoples in the 1500s. If Hatteras natives in 1650 are claiming ancestors who could read, where did that skill come from? The most likely answer is Roanoke colonists who taught literacy to their children and grandchildren, even as those children were growing up as Croatoan. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Excavations at sites associated with the Croatoan have found English artifacts dating to the late 1500s. Things like gun parts, sword hilts, copper bangles made from English trade goods. More intriguingly, they've found evidence of English construction techniques in native settlements. Things like root cellars and worked lumber that suggests English colonists were teaching native peoples their building methods, or building structures themselves within native villages. DNA studies of modern descendants of Hatteras Island families show European genetic markers that predate later colonization. In other words, there was European DNA mixing with native populations in that region before Jamestown, before any other English colonies. The most likely source is Roanoke colonists. So the mystery of the Lost Colony is not really a mystery. The colonists went to Croatoan, as the carvings said. Some probably integrated with the Croatoan people on Hatteras Island. Others may have been taken in by other tribes. They learned native languages. They married into native families. Their children became native in culture and identity. Within a generation or two, the English colonists of Roanoke had ceased to exist as a separate group and had become part of the indigenous population. But this answer is not mysterious enough. It's not dramatic enough. It doesn't fit the narrative of English exceptionalism and cultural superiority that was developing in colonial America. The idea that English colonists would choose to become native, would abandon English culture and customs, would raise their children as Native Americans, that idea was troubling to later colonists. It suggested that English culture wasn't obviously superior. It suggested that native ways of life might actually be preferable in some circumstances. It suggested that the clear line between civilized and savage wasn't so clear after all. So instead of accepting the obvious answer, historians and writers invented mysteries. Maybe the colonists were killed by hostile natives. Maybe they died of disease. Maybe they tried to sail to England and were lost at sea. Maybe they were abducted by Spanish raiders. Maybe, if you believe the most outlandish theories, they were taken by aliens or disappeared into a supernatural portal. All of these theories ignore the evidence and the obvious conclusion. They ignore what the colonists themselves said they were going to do. They ignore the archaeological record. They ignore native oral traditions. They ignore later reports of English people living among native tribes. They create a mystery where none exists because the real answer is uncomfortable. The real answer is that English colonists, faced with starvation and isolation, chose to join native communities. They chose native life over English life. They chose survival over cultural purity. And their descendants lived on, not as English people, but as Croatoan, as Hatteras, as members of various Algonquian communities. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, probably grew up speaking Croatoan. She probably learned to fish with weirs and nets. She probably learned which plants to gather and how to process them. She probably wore deerskin clothes and married a Croatoan man and raised children who had no memory of England at all. She probably died an old woman, surrounded by her grandchildren, never knowing that back in England her name would become a symbol of lost innocence and vanished colonies. The mystery of Roanoke tells us more about the people asking the questions than it does about what actually happened. It tells us that colonizers would rather invent mysteries than accept that their predecessors found native life preferable to English life. It tells us that the voices and knowledge of native peoples are consistently ignored, dismissed, or disbelieved. It tells us that history is written by people who have a vested interest in certain narratives, and those narratives shape what we call a mystery and what we accept as obvious. The Croatoan knew what happened to the lost colony. They were living alongside the survivors, trading with them, intermarrying with them. The stories were passed down through generations. But when English colonists asked about Roanoke, did they really listen to the answers? Did they believe what they were told? Or did they decide that native testimony was unreliable? That native oral traditions were just stories, that only English written records could be trusted? The lost colony of Roanoke is lost only because we refuse to accept where it went. It went to Croatoan. It went native. And for centuries, that answer has been too unsettling for the descendants of colonizers to fully embrace. Because if the Roanoke colonists could abandon English culture and thrive as members of native communities, what does that say about the entire colonial project? What does that say about the supposed superiority of European civilization? The mystery of Roanoke is not what happened to 115 colonists. The mystery is why we keep pretending we don't know, when the answer has been there all along, carved into a post, recorded in native traditions, buried in the archaeological record, written in the DNA of modern descendants. The colonists integrated. They survived. They became part of something larger than England, older than colonization, more resilient than empire. And that's the real story of the Lost Colony, the one that's been hiding in plain sight for 400 years, waiting for someone to finally listen to what the Croatoan have been saying all along. They didn't vanish. They came home, just not to the home anyone expected. The brutal reality of being a pilgrim in Plymouth, life among the chosen people. We've spent 3 segments talking about the native peoples, about Tisquantum's tragedy, about the Roanoke colonists who integrated with indigenous communities. Now, let's turn the lens around and look at the pilgrims themselves. Not the sanitized version from elementary school pageants, but the actual people who crossed the Atlantic in 1620. Because if you think it sucked to be Wampanoag in 1621, imagine being a pilgrim. Imagine being so convinced of your religious righteousness that you sailed across an ocean into a world you didn't understand, with inadequate supplies, insufficient knowledge, and an unshakable belief that God would provide. Spoiler alert, God did not provide. The Wampanoag did, and even then, barely half of you survived. Let's start with who these people actually were, because they weren't just generic colonists seeking opportunity. They were religious separatists, a group so extreme in their beliefs that they couldn't coexist with the Church of England. They believed the Anglican Church was irredeemably corrupt, still too Catholic, too ceremonial, too hierarchical. They wanted a pure church, a congregation of believers without bishops or formal liturgy, without religious hierarchy telling them how to worship. This was radical stuff in the early 1600s. This was the kind of thinking that got you arrested, fined, or worse. So they left England and went to the Netherlands, to Leiden, where religious tolerance was greater. They lived there for about 12 years, from 1608 to 1620, and they were miserable. Yes, they had religious freedom, but their children were becoming Dutch. They were learning Dutch, adopting Dutch customs, marrying Dutch people. The separatists were losing their English identity, and they couldn't have that. They also struggled economically. They were mostly farmers and craftspeople, and they couldn't compete in the Dutch economy. They worked long hours for little pay. They were poor, struggling, and watching their communities slowly dissolve into Dutch society. The children issue was particularly galling to the separatist leaders. They'd see their sons working alongside Dutch boys, picking up Dutch swear words, Dutch games, Dutch attitudes. They'd see their daughters walking with Dutch young men, learning Dutch songs, wearing Dutch-style clothing. The parents had sacrificed everything for religious purity, and their children were becoming something else entirely. The younger generation didn't have the same memories of persecution in England. They didn't carry the same religious fervor. To them, Leiden was home. They were becoming Dutch Calvinists rather than English separatists. And to the older generation, this was a crisis. The economic situation made everything worse. In England, many of these families had been farmers with their own land, craftspeople with established businesses. They'd had status, community position, a place in society. In Leiden, they were immigrants. They took whatever work they could get. They worked in the textile industry, which meant long hours, low pay, and harsh conditions. Men who'd been independent farmers were now hired laborers. Women who'd managed households were now taking in washing or spinning wool for pennies. Children as young as 6 or 7 were working in workshops. The dream of religious freedom was becoming a nightmare of poverty and social decline. So they decided to go to America, not because they were brave pioneers seeking adventure, but because they were desperate religious extremists who couldn't make it work anywhere in Europe. They negotiated with the Virginia Company for a land patent. They got financial backing from a group of London merchants who saw potential profit in a new world colony. And in September 1620, 102 passengers and about 30 crew members crammed onto a ship called the Mayflower and set sail for Virginia. The financial arrangement was brutal. The Pilgrims essentially indentured themselves to the merchant investors for 7 years. Everything they produced, everything they built, everything they created for 7 years would belong to the investors. Only after 7 years of labor would the colonists own their own property. They were trading one form of bondage for another, gambling that 7 years of servitude in America would be better than a lifetime of poverty in Leiden. Except they didn't end up in Virginia. They ended up 220 miles north of their intended destination, on Cape Cod, in November. They arrived at the beginning of winter, in a region they hadn't planned for, with no established colony to join, no support network, no nothing. It was a disaster from the start. The Mayflower was not a large ship. It was about 100 feet long and 25 feet wide. Now cram 100 of passengers and 30 crew members into that space for 66 days. There's no privacy. There's barely room to stand up in the passenger deck. It's dark, damp, and cold. The ship is constantly moving, pitching and rolling in the Atlantic swells. Almost everyone is seasick for the first week or two. The smell is unimaginable, a combination of unwashed bodies, vomit, human waste, spoiled food, and bilge water. The toilet facilities, such as they are, consist of buckets that get emptied over the side when weather permits. You're eating hardtack, which is basically a rock-hard biscuit that you have to soften in water or beer before you can chew it. You're eating salted meat that's already starting to turn. You're rationing water and beer, the beer because water doesn't keep well on long voyages. You're cold all the time. You're wet all the time. If you're a woman, you're probably pregnant or caring for small children in these conditions. If you're a child, you're terrified and sick and don't understand why your parents brought you to this nightmare. The pregnant women had it particularly bad. Dorothy Bradford, wife of William Bradford who would become governor, was pregnant when the Mayflower sailed. The constant motion of the ship, the lack of nutrition, the stress, all of it threatened her pregnancy and her health. Elizabeth Hopkins gave birth during the voyage, delivering her son Oceanus in conditions that would horrify any modern medical professional. No sterile environment, no pain relief, no guarantee that she or the baby would survive. Just other women holding her hands, whispering encouragement and hoping for the best. One person dies during the voyage, a young man named William Button. One baby is born, Oceanus Hopkins. His mother went into labor in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, in a dark, wet, crowded ship, with no doctor, no midwife, just other women who've given birth before and are doing their best. The baby survives. The mother survives. It's a small miracle in the midst of ongoing misery. And then, after 66 days, you see land. Cape Cod. It's the wrong land. You were supposed to be in Virginia, but it's land. You're so relieved you could cry, except you're too dehydrated and exhausted to produce tears. The Mayflower anchors in Provincetown Harbor. On November 11th, 1620, you've survived the crossing. Now you just have to survive everything else. But you can't just go ashore and start building. First, there's the political problem. You're not in Virginia, which means your land patent is worthless. You're technically in territory with no legal authority. Some of the passengers, The ones who weren't part of the religious separatist group but came along for economic opportunities. They're talking about doing whatever they want once they get off the ship. They don't recognize any authority. They signed on to go to Virginia under Virginia Company rules, and this isn't Virginia. So the leaders write up the Mayflower Compact, a document establishing self-governance. It's been romanticized as an early example of democracy, a precursor to the Constitution. Really, it's a desperate attempt to prevent anarchy. It basically says we agree to make laws and follow them, and will obey whoever we elect as leader. It's signed by 41 of the adult men. The women don't sign because of course they don't. This is 1620. The servants and children don't sign. It's not democracy. It's just enough structure to prevent complete chaos. Now you can go ashore. You're in New England in November. If you know anything about New England weather, you know this is a terrible time to arrive. It's cold. It's going to get much colder. Winter is coming, and you have no shelter, no stored food, no preparation whatsoever. The men form exploration parties. They're looking for a place to settle, somewhere with fresh water, defensible position, and ideally cleared land they can plant. They explore Cape Cod, and it's during one of these explorations that they find buried stores of corn, native corn, buried by the Wampanoag for winter use. The pilgrims take it. They call it a gift from God. It's theft. It's literally grave robbing, because some of these storage pits are in burial sites. But the pilgrims are starving and desperate, and they convince themselves that God provided this corn for them, that the fact that it was already harvested and stored is evidence of divine providence, rather than theft from people who will need it to survive winter. They also find an abandoned village, Patuxet. It's empty because everyone died in the plague. The fields are already cleared. There are even stored supplies left behind. Again, the pilgrims see this as God's hand clearing the land for them. They don't see it as a mass grave. They don't think about the thousands of people who died here. They just see opportunity, providence, proof that they're God's chosen people and this land was meant for them. They decide to settle at Patuxet, which they rename Plymouth. It's December now. Winter has arrived, and they're living on the Mayflower because they haven't built houses yet. They're trying to build, but it's slow work. They don't have enough tools. They don't have enough healthy workers. They're already getting sick. The cold, the damp, the malnutrition, the stress, it's all catching up with them. This is when people start dying in earnest. By winter's end, half of the passengers will be dead. Half. That's 51 people out of 102. They're dying of scurvy, pneumonia, exposure, tuberculosis, and simple starvation. They're dying faster than they can bury them. At one point, they're losing 2 or 3 people a day. They start burying people at night so the natives won't see how weak they've become. They're afraid that if the local tribes realize how few of them are left, they'll attack and wipe them out completely. Imagine being a mother watching your child waste away from scurvy. Their gums bleeding, their teeth loosening, their skin bruising at the slightest touch. Imagine being a husband watching your wife die of pneumonia in a partially built house with no heat and no medicine. Imagine being one of the healthy ones, and there are only a few, having to care for everyone else. Bury the dead, continue building shelter, find food, and somehow keep the colony from complete collapse. William Bradford, who becomes governor after the first governor dies that winter, writes in his journal about the suffering. He talks about people being abandoned by friends and family as they lay dying, because the healthy were too busy trying to survive themselves. He talks about the smell of the sick room, the sound of coughing and moaning, the despair of watching people give up and die. He also talks about the few, and there were less than a dozen, who stayed healthy and cared for everyone else. These people, many of them the servants and workers rather than the religious leaders, they're the heroes of Plymouth's first winter. They're emptying chamber pots, washing soiled clothes, cooking what little food there is, sitting with the dying, burying the dead, all while trying not to get sick themselves. By spring, there are about 50 survivors. They've lost their governor, their military leader, and many of their craftspeople and laborers. The survivors are traumatized, malnourished, and still dangerously vulnerable. They don't know how to fish these waters. They don't know which plants are edible. They don't know when or how to plant crops in this climate. They're on the edge of complete failure. And this is when Samoset walks into Plymouth and says, in English, "Welcome." A few days later, Tisquantum arrives. And these two men, for their own complicated reasons, teach the pilgrims how to survive. They show them how to catch eels, how to catch fish, where the good fishing spots are, how to plant corn with fish fertilizer. They tell them which plants are edible and which will kill them. They act as intermediaries with Massasoit, establishing the alliance that will, temporarily, keep the pilgrims safe from attack. Without Tisquantum and Samoset, Plymouth fails. There's no question about it. The pilgrims were incompetent, unprepared, and dying. They were saved by the very people they considered savage heathens in need of Christian civilization. The irony is so thick, you could cut it with a knife. The pilgrims never fully acknowledged this debt. In their letters and journals, they thank God. They talk about divine providence. They mention the Indians helping, but always in the context of God sending the Indians to help. As if the Wampanoag were tools of divine will rather than autonomous people making their own decisions. The pilgrim narrative is always about God's chosen people being tested and preserved by God's hand. The Wampanoag are supporting characters, not the main reason the colony survived. Life in Plymouth doesn't get easy after the first winter. Even with Wampanoag help, the pilgrims struggle. They're terrible farmers in this environment. Their first harvest is mediocre. They're still dependent on trade with the Wampanoag for food. They're still getting sick, though not dying at the same rate. They're still cold, still struggling, still barely hanging on. And they're strict. Religiously strict. Morally strict. Socially strict. This is not a fun place to live. Church attendance is mandatory. Church services are hours long, and you're expected to sit still and pay attention. If you fall asleep during the sermon, you get fined or put in the stocks. If you work on the Sabbath, you get punished. If you drink too much, you get punished. If you have sex outside of marriage, you get whipped publicly. If you question the religious authorities, you get expelled from the colony. There's no privacy. Everyone knows everyone else's business. The houses are small, often just one room where an entire family sleeps, eats, and lives. Neighbors watch neighbors for signs of moral weakness or religious deviation. It's a surveillance state built on religious righteousness and communal judgment. The work is endless. If you're a man, you're farming, hunting, building, maintaining, defending. If you're a woman, you're cooking, cleaning, sewing, caring for children, preserving food, making soap and candles, spinning and weaving. If you're a child, you're working as soon as you're old enough to hold a tool or carry water. There's no leisure. There's no entertainment. There's no music or dancing because those are considered sinful. There's just work, church, and more work. The food is monotonous. Corn in various forms. Cornbread, corn porridge, corn everything. Fish when you can catch it. Game when hunting is successful. Vegetables from the garden in summer, preserved or stored for winter. No sugar except occasionally honey. No spices, no variety. The same basic meals, day after day, year after year. If you came from England hoping for a better life, you're probably regretting it. And always, there's the fear. Fear of native attack, even though the alliance with Massasoit holds. Fear of starvation if the harvest fails. Fear of disease. Fear of death. Fear of God's judgment. The pilgrims believe they're being tested. Every hardship is a test of faith. Every death is either God's will or punishment for sin. You're never allowed to just be angry or sad or frustrated. You have to interpret everything through the lens of God's plan, and that plan apparently involves a lot of suffering. The 1621 harvest feast, the one we call the first Thanksgiving, happens in this context. It's not a celebration of friendship with the natives. It's not a moment of multicultural harmony. It's a brief respite in a life of grinding difficulty, religious extremism, and barely avoided disaster. The pilgrims have survived 1 year. They've managed to bring in a harvest, though not a great one. They're still alive, which given the first winter, is something of a miracle. So they have a feast. Massasoit and 90 Wampanoag show up, probably because they heard gunfire and thought there was trouble. They stay for 3 days, because leaving immediately would be diplomatically rude. The Wampanoag provide most of the food. It's awkward and tense, and probably not much fun for anyone. And then it's over, and life goes back to being hard and strict and joyless. This is what it meant to be a pilgrim, not brave pioneers conquering a wilderness, but desperate religious extremists barely surviving in a land they didn't understand, saved by people they considered inferior, living under harsh rules they imposed on themselves, convinced that their suffering was proof of God's favor. They created a community built on religious intolerance, communal surveillance, and unrelenting work. They stole from native food stores, occupied a plague village, and called it God's providence. They took Wampanoag help and wrote it off as divine intervention. And they established a pattern that would repeat across the continent, the pattern of seeing native peoples as obstacles or tools rather than as human beings with their own rights and sovereignty. The pilgrims were not heroes. They were survivors, barely, and only because the Wampanoag chose to help them. Their story is not one of triumph over adversity through faith and determination. It's a story of incompetence, dependence, and the beginning of a colonial enterprise that would destroy the very people who saved them. And every year, when we celebrate Thanksgiving, we're celebrating a myth that erases this reality, that turns a complex, tragic, morally ambiguous history into a simple story about sharing and gratitude. The pilgrims suffered. That's true. They endured hardships most of us can't imagine. But their suffering doesn't make them heroic. It makes them human. And their humanity included theft, religious extremism, cultural arrogance, and a willingness to accept help from people they considered savages, while simultaneously planning to take their land. That's the real story of Plymouth Colony. That's what being a pilgrim actually meant. And that's what we should remember when we sit down to our Thanksgiving feast. Surrounded by abundance, the pilgrims could never have imagined, in a country built on land taken from the people who saved them. If this helped you relax and learn something new, Gently tap that subscribe button for more sleepy disasters every week. Sweet dreams, and remember, you're safe in your bed, unlike the people we just learned about. Sleep well.